Our second scripture comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 35 to 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant to us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "Well, the cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized, but to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them. Their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." You remember that other place in the gospel where Jesus says, "Anything you ask in my name, you shall receive." Most of us probably heard that verse when we were kids. It played a really special part in my life. I remember very, very clearly, very intently, knowing that verse and praying as hard as I could pray, "Oh God, please give me a go-kart." And every time a delivery truck came down Chalfont Street in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, I would run to the window and wait for it to stop and unload that big box with the go-kart. Maybe you did something like that. I believe that verse. I took it very seriously. I think James and John did too. Now, that verse does appear in Mark's gospel in the next chapter after this one, but there is no reason to think that the gospels are necessarily arranged in chronological sequence. Indeed, when we read all 4 of the gospels, we see that various stories get placed in different places in the narrative. And I think that's important to see because the gospel writers aren't writing history books for us. They aren't interested in us knowing the exact sequence things happened. They really want us to come to faith. And these are the stories that they take from Jesus' life that they want us to understand, and they put them in the sequence they do to help us find faith. And so when I read this, I believe that it's likely that this passage that we've read today comes after Jesus telling his disciples, "Ask whatever you want in my name, and it will be granted to you." And James and John are taking Jesus at his word at this point. They hear him say, "Ask whatever you want," and they go, "We got it. We're going to get right and left." Now, we're not going to fight over which one of us gets which one, but we're going to get there. We're going to ask Jesus before anybody else has a chance, and that's indeed what they do. And I think that's why the rest of the disciples are angry at James and John here. Not because of what they asked, but because they were smart enough to ask first. They're angry that James and John pushed their way to the front of the line, and they got what everybody wanted, the prize seats. Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I ask first? And Jesus looks at this going on, and he knows what they're upset about, and he's more than a little bit flummoxed by it all. Yet again, you guys don't get it. You're missing the fact that the rules of my kingdom are not like the rules of the dominant system. When Jesus says Gentiles here, he's really just pointing a finger at the Roman Empire with its systems of shame and guilt, with zero-sum gains, with the idea that one always grabs and uses power for oneself, and whatever you can take, you take it, because if you don't, someone else will. And the expectation was, in every interaction, that someone would be a winner and someone would be a loser, and by God, you want to be the winner in all of it. And Jesus is just looking at that, and he's saying, no. In my kingdom, those who are greatest are the servants of all. The Roman Empire is gone, but the system still exists. Another story from my childhood, maybe you did this as well, at least those of us who are, how did I hear it on the radio this morning? People of a certain age. One of the highlights of my year was when the Sears Christmas catalog came out. What?
The smell of it.
The smell of it. And I would get that catalog, and I would get my pen out. And I would go through the catalog, and I would circle the toys that I wanted. There were more things circled than not, I think, by the time I was finished. Now, as I got older and got past the toy phase, I didn't do that anymore, but I do have relatives who did, who continued well into adulthood, taking the Sears Christmas catalog. They didn't circle toys anymore. Instead, they circled clothing or tools. And if it was clothing, they would circle it, and then they would write, this is the color I want, and this is the size that it needs to be. And so everybody knew when they picked up the Christmas catalog. And it was a helpful thing. You know, it was like those lists we make on Amazon now. If someone wanted to get me a present, all they needed to do was open up our family copy of the Sears Christmas catalog, and they could find what I wanted. Well, we got older yet, and things changed in life, and the Sears Christmas catalog didn't play much of a role anymore, but the Sears store continued to be important in our lives. I think Cheryl and I bought almost all of our large appliances at Sears. And the vast majority of them had that Kenmore name on them, regardless of whether or not Kenmore actually produced the appliance. They might have been made by Whirlpool or LG or who knows what other company. But they said Kenmore on it, and we trusted that. We trusted that. And when I needed a tool for a house project or to do something on my car, the first question I asked was, am I going to use this tool again? And if I was going to use it again, then I wanted it to be that right balance between the quality of the tool and the amount I was going to pay for it. And the first brand name that always came to me when I wanted quality that was also affordable was Craftsman. And I still have a Craftsman club card in my drawer. I do. Now, I did buy some other tools that were cheaper. Most of those are gone. But the ones that I bought because I wanted a tool that was going to last and work, they say Craftsman on them. Sears had gone from a company, did you know they began as a watch company? They sold watches and repaired watches, to what was an iconic and important company throughout the 20th century. Most of people's homes had something in them that came from Sears. Indeed, some of the homes themselves came from Sears. They used to be able to buy a kit house from Sears. There are a couple of them in Guadalupe. The Guadalupe Dunes Museum was a kit house that came from Sears, that someone bought in the Sears catalog, and they delivered all the stuff in a truck and dumped it in the yard, and they put together a house. Well, more recently, Sears had problems. They were victims of changes in the marketplace. Maybe some of the leadership had made some bad decisions, and then there was that company, what's it called, Amazon and eBay, that showed up, and more people find themselves buying things online rather than going to brick and mortar stores, and they were having trouble, and so they decided to make some changes. They hired a new CEO named Eddie Lampert. And Eddie Lampert, like many in the GOP leadership over the last couple of years, is a follower of Ayn Rand. He's a devotee of Ayn Rand. And he looked at Ayn Rand, whose ideas paralleled some of those foundational ideas of modern capitalism in its purest form. Ayn Rand believed that altruism is destructive, that working for the common good is stupid and counterproductive. That instead, what we needed to embrace was what she called rational self-interest. If you read her carefully, she basically said, you put yourself above everyone and everything else. You look at your personal interests first and above all else, and indeed, if you find at some point that your personal interest needs to be sacrificed at all for anything else or anyone else, you put yourself first. In the marketplace, that morphed into this belief that when everyone is out for their own self-interest, that somehow that frees the hand of the marketplace and results in progress forward. And Lampert, looking at Sears that was struggling so, said, we're going to put those ideas into practice in the most pure of ways. And so he began by dividing Sears into 30 independent divisions. And he went to them, he brought all of the leaders of those 30 divisions together, and he said, you are going to be in competition with each other. If you want bonuses, you have to do better than the other 29 divisions. If you want to rise to the top, you have to do that by stepping on these other 29 divisions. The intention was that the weakest of the divisions would die, leaving a stronger and more profitable company. Instead, what happened was those 30 divisions went so far as to work to undermine each other, regardless of the impact on the larger company. The appliances division put forward outside brands instead of Kenmore, because that seemed to help their bottom line. The areas in the various local stores refused to have sales as loss leaders to get people into the building, because that made them look bad when they compared them to the divisions that hadn't had the loss leaders. And so it ended up that none of them worked to bring people into the stores. They would compete with each other for space in the print ads. And some got the space and others didn't. And down the company went. And you probably heard last week, Sears declared bankruptcy as a model of this kind of being that says we will look out first and foremost for ourselves. There are even stories that through the midst of that, Eddie Lampert, who was a very wealthy man, bought divisions of the company that were most profitable for himself. I don't know about that. It seems to follow. Now, we don't know how things would have gone had they sat down with all of those division heads at the beginning and said, what can we do to work together to make this company more successful? Amazon is still there. eBay is still there. And all of those market forces that are going on in our culture that mitigate against brick and mortar stores are all still there. Sears may indeed still have ended up declaring bankruptcy. But I can't imagine that had they sat down and said, what can we do together, that things could have possibly been worse than they already were. We found in more recent years that evolutionary anthropologists are now arguing that altruism, that working for the common good, is a trait that has evolved in humans because it works. That we give of ourselves for others because it works. It's almost as if they're saying, it was God's plan that we be servants one to another. And Lambert's example is an extreme example of this system that Jesus condemned, but we see that in lots of areas of life, don't we? We see politicians who use their positions to line their own profits, who put personal ambition above the common good. We all heard about that pharmaceutical executive who raised the price of a life-saving drug 5,000% and was widely condemned for that. But we didn't hear so much about another pharmaceutical exec from Nostrum Pharmaceuticals who only raised the price of his life-saving drug 500%. And when asked about that in an interview in Financial Times, he said this, "I think it is a moral requirement to make money when you can, to sell the product for the highest possible price." That's exactly what Ayn Rand would have said, that it is a moral requirement to take whatever you can get. And that's what he said. We can find examples of that in every area of life. And Jesus simply says, no, the one that wants to be first must be the servant of all. The idea was so central in the earliest churches that the descriptor servant becomes a title for a church leader. And that title was so important that they transliterated over into English. The word for servant in Greek is diakonos, and in English it becomes the word deacon. But you know, when I read that, I wonder if the reality was that it wasn't meant to be a title as much as just a descriptor of who that person was. Joshua wasn't a deacon, he was a servant. And he's raised up whatever that leader's name might have been at the time, because that person served and gave of himself for others. That person served and gave of herself for others. And it becomes so clearly stated that it comes in that hymn that's quoted in Philippians, where we're told to have the mind in ourselves that was also in Christ Jesus, who poured himself out for us, rather than accumulated in for himself. Now, we see that good piece, the good side of that, exemplified in life as well, don't we? We see it in parents who give of themselves for their children, who sacrifice again and again for their children, because there's something that's inside them that says, you serve, you pour yourself out. We see it in soldiers who give of themselves for their comrades. We see it in firefighters who go running into a building knowing sensible people don't do this. But it's what they do because there is something built into us that says we give of ourselves for the common good. We see it in people who voluntarily pay their taxes. And when they see those bumper stickers that say freedom is not free, they know that indeed that's true. And it means more than soldiers giving their lives. It also means for people writing checks. It's not free. It's not free. That God has built into us this ethic of giving of ourselves. but it is always held in tension in human life with the power of sin that conspires to make us selfish and self-centered. And that is sin. Those of us who claim to follow Jesus cannot go that way. Instead, we hear the call to be servants, to give of ourselves to others, even and especially those to whom or from whom we get nothing in return. To give of ourselves for the poor, for the refugee, for the lonely, for the sick, for the prisoner, for the disenfranchised. To become servants of all. And that is the way of Jesus. That is the ethic, that is the political plan, that is the economic plan, that is the social plan. That is the way of Jesus' kingdom. To be servants. That's your call and mine.